The reader will pardon me for having spoken at such length on my first initiation to a knowledge of a period of history which occupied my entire attention, and the magnificent commencement of which, marked by the most important transactions of this new era, the Continental Peace, the Concordat, and the Maritime Peace, was among my most interesting memories for the special reason that I had been directly connected with it. The proclamation of the general peace coincided with the date of my admission into the confidence of Napoleon, and the day from which my lot began to be bound up with his destiny. Like so many others of the same period, I experienced the magnetic influence which this powerful genius exercised over all those who approached him. As a satellite, I was faithful to the impulse I had received, and the sun, in whose sphere of attraction I had never ceased to revolve, had for its device nec pluribus impar, a device which in this case was no flatterer, but the strictest expression of truth. I returned to Paris with Joseph Bonaparte towards the end of March 1802. He took me aside one day and told me that the First Consul wished to see me and would receive me at the Tuileries on the morrow. He confided to me that the head of the state had decided to attach me to his cabinet, that he was dissatisfied with Bourrienne, and that as soon as I had familiarized myself with his work, he would dismiss him, and that I should occupy his place. I saw in this proposal the fresh proof of the assiduous kindness of Joseph Bonaparte and his desire to promote my welfare, but at the same time I was perplexed. I begged him to dissuade the First Consul from this project, alleging that I did not feel myself at all capable of filling the post for which he intended me, and confessed that I feared the loss of my independence. Joseph Bonaparte said everything that the affection with which he honored me could suggest to him, persuading me not to throw away the opportunity of advancement and fortune which his friendship had procured for me. I remember that General Bernadotte, who was present, added her persuasions to those of Joseph Bonaparte to make me change my mind, pointing out to me the happiness of a life with so great a man, where I should be the constant witness of the inspiration of his genius. He seemed to lack words to express the admiration and devotion which he appeared to feel for the First Consul. On the morning of the 2nd of April, Joseph Bonaparte gave me a letter from General Duroc, who wrote to tell me that the First Consul could receive me at 5 o'clock in the afternoon of that day. I was obliged to accept an invitation which is really a command. General Duroc conducted me to Madame Bonaparte, who received me with exquisite grace and politeness. She was kind enough to talk to me of the business which had brought me to the Tuileries. I was encouraged by her kindness to tell her the objections I felt to a gilded chain. She succeeded in making me agree to remain 3 years only with the First Consul. I should be free to retire at the end of that time, and she assured me that the First Consul would reward me with an honorable post, and further undertook to gain his consent to this arrangement. I mention this circumstance to show with what cleverness she could enter into the sentiments of others and appear to share their illusions. On reflection, I had no reason to hope that the First Consul would agree to a transaction of this kind, or would, indeed, approve of my dictating terms. Madame Bonaparte did me the honor to say that I must be her guest at dinner that night. A moment after, Madame Louis Bonaparte, Hortense, entered the drawing-room, and the conversation became general. In the meanwhile, time was passing. At last, at about 7 o'clock, the sound of hurried steps on the staircase, which led to the room in which we were sitting, announced the arrival of the First Consul. Madame Bonaparte introduced me to him. He condescended to receive me with the kindness which at once dissipated the respectful awe in which I stood. He walked rapidly into the dining-room, whither I followed Madame Bonaparte and her daughter. Madame Bonaparte made me sit next to her. The First Consul spoke to me several times during the dinner, which only lasted 20 minutes. He spoke of my studies and of Palaiseau, with a kindness and a simplicity which put me entirely at my ease, and showed me how gentle and simple this man, who bore in his forehead and in his eyes the mark of such imposing superiority, was in his private life. When I returned to the drawing-room, we found General Davout. The first consul walked up and down the room with him conversing, and a quarter of an hour later disappeared in the staircase from which he had come, without having spoken to me of the matter for which he had ordered my attendance. I remained with Madame Bonaparte around 11 o'clock. I asked her to be so good as to tell me whether I should go away, thinking that I had been forgotten. She told me to remain and assured me that the first consul would send for me. True enough, a footman came to fetch me. I followed him down a long passage to a staircase by which we reached a little door at which he knocked. There was a wicket in this door, which I examined with curiosity. My state of mind was such that I seemed to be outside the place of eternal imprisonment, and involuntarily I raised my eyes to see whether I could not read over the door that inscription of Dante's: Lasciate ogni speranza voce entrante. Give up all hope, those who enter here. An usher who had looked through the wicket opened the door after some words with the footman, and I was shown into a small drawing room poorly lighted. Whilst I was being announced, I cast a rapid glance around the room, being anxious to acquaint myself with what was to be my prison. The furniture consisted of some chairs covered with green morocco and a very luxurious roll-top writing table, which was loaded with gilt bronze ornaments and inlaid with rosewood mosaics representing various musical instruments, and afterwards learned that these pieces of furniture had belonged to Louis XVI. It was subsequently sent to the garde meuble as useless. A low bookcase ran round one side of the room. Some papers were scattered on the top. I was announced and immediately afterwards was ushered into a room where I saw the first consul seated behind a writing table. A three-branched flambeau, covered with a shade, cast a strong light on the table. The rest of the room was in the shade, broken only by the light from the fire on the hearth. The first consul's back was toward me, and he was occupied in reading a paper, and finished reading it without taking notice of my entrance. He then turned around in his chair toward me. I had remained standing at the door of his cabinet, and on seeing him turn around, I approached him. After having examined me for a moment with a piercing glance, which would have greatly intimidated me if I had seen it there for the first time, he told me that he wished to attach me to his service and asked me if I felt myself strong enough to undertake the task which he proposed to confide to me. I answered him with some embarrassment, with the commonplace remark that I was not very sure of myself, but that I would do all in my power to justify his confidence. I kept my objections to myself because I knew that he would not like them, and besides, the way in which he'd received me at dinner had considerably weakened them. He did not seem dissatisfied with my answer, for he rose from his seat and came up to me smiling, rather sardonically, it is true, and pulled my ear, which I knew to be a sign of favor. He then said to me, "Very well, come back tomorrow morning at 7 and come straight here." That was all the conversation which preceded my admission into his sanctuary, which I imagine is a sort of place from which nothing but invisible oracles proceeded, accompanied by lightning and thunder. Such was the very simple investiture which I received for a post, the responsibility of which seemed so terrible that, when it was proposed to me, I could only think of it with terror. After this short audience and this laconic dialogue, the first consul made a sign with his hand, which I took for an order to withdraw, and left me to go into an adjoining drawing room where no doubt some business awaited him. Slightly reassured by the simplicity of this commencement, I went back the way I had come, preceded by my guide who had waited for me outside the door. Nothing but solitude and silence reigned in the dimly lighted corridors through which I passed. I met nobody on my way out except a sentry placed at the gate of the inner court. I went back to the Hotel Marboeuf, where Hotel Joseph Bonaparte was then living. I had gone to bed. He had gone to bed, but I sent my card up to him and told him what had happened. He gave me fresh encouragement, and I returned to the apartment which I occupied in the house. I was in a very anxious state of mind and felt little disposed for sleep. I stood in need of the calm of the night to reflect on what had happened to me that day, so fruitful to me in unexpected events. I went over in my mind my introduction to Madame Bonaparte and to the First Consul, the simplicity of their home life, that simple and familiar dinner, and my reception in the evening. My ideas were confused in my head. I could not accustom myself to the thought that I was irresistibly led on toward the goal which I had desired, and that I found myself destined for a future, the perspective of which was so different from the one I had imagined. I was then 24 years of age. What did fortune want with me, who asked nothing of her? No doubt this change of condition was advantageous. But should I be fitted for my new position? Was I not putting my neck into an iron yoke which I should not be able to bear? I was in that state of perplexity which always besets a man in his passage from the known to the unknown. These reflections kept me awake. I got up before daybreak and made my way to the Tuileries, arriving there before the appointed hour. I rather feared that I should not be able to find my way in the intricacies of the palace, and that I should have difficulty in explaining to the sentries who I was, and was very much surprised at the ease with which I made my way to the door through which I had passed the previous evening, and which I recognized by the wicket in it. As soon as he saw me, the usher showed me into the cabinet, which was empty. The First Consul was in his drawing room with the Minister of Finance, Monsieur Gaudin, who afterwards became Duc de Gaeta. I sat down at a table which stood in the embrasure of a window and waited for nearly 2 hours for the return of the First Consul. He arrived at last, holding a paper in his hand, without appearing to pay any attention to my presence in his study, just as if I had always been there and had always occupied the same place. He dictated a note for the Minister of Finance with such volubility that I could hardly understand or take down half of what he was dictating. Without asking me whether I had heard him or whether I had finished writing, he took the paper away from me and would not let me read it over, and on my remarking it was an unintelligible scribble, he said it was on a matter well known to the minister, who would easily be able to make it out, and so saying he went back to the drawing room. I never knew if Monsieur Gaudin was able to decipher my writing. I feared that the paper might be sent back to me, and that I might be asked to explain what I had written, which would have been quite impossible. I never heard any more about it. The First Consul returned almost immediately. He sent for General Duroc and ordered him to have rooms prepared for me in the palace and to invite me to the table of the ladies and the aides-de-camp in service, over which the general presided. Chateaubriand entered the room and seemed surprised to find me there. It was the first time that I had seen him in the First Consul's study. The First Consul told him to have a table arranged for himself in the outside room and to give the table in the window where I had written the note from dictation up to me. Brienne had been in ignorance of my introduction into the First Consul's cabinet. At first he examined me with curiosity, giving me a cold salute, and his manner soon became more friendly. General Duroc took me away to lunch, and we separated from Brienne. I afterwards learned that he was accustomed to take his meals in his private rooms. I returned to the study after lunch. The First Consul came back late and spent almost the whole day receiving people in his drawing room, so I had plenty of time to think over my new position and to occupy myself with Brienne's arrangements and my own. Before continuing my story, I will trace the portrait of Napoleon as I saw him at this time. He was then in the enjoyment of vigorous health. He had recently been cured of an internal disease from which he had begun to suffer greatly during the second year of the consulate. This suffering was caused by an inveterate cutaneous affection which had been driven into the system by the remedies he had taken, of which the skillful Dr. Corvisor had just relieved him. I have heard it said that during the siege of Toulon, one of the gunners of a battery where Napoleon was killed. It was important that the firing should not slacken. Napoleon took the rammer and loaded the cannon several times. Some days later, he was covered with a very malignant itching skin disease. He tried to remember when and where he could have caught this disease. It was then discovered that the artilleryman from whose burning hand Napoleon had taken the rammer was infected. In the carelessness of youth and being entirely absorbed in his work, he had neglected to undergo any treatment. He contented himself with some remedies which only caused the outward signs of the disease to disappear. But the poison had been driven into his system and caused great damage. This was the reason, it was added, of the extreme thinness and poor weak look of Napoleon during the campaigns of Italy and Egypt. In the second year of the consulate, as his health grew worse and worse each day, he thought it necessary to undergo serious treatment. General Lannes urged him to consult Dr. Corvisart. The general's father-in-law brought Corvisart, who was his doctor and friend, to La Malmaison. Napoleon entrusted his case to the doctor. Corvisart treated him with blisters and prescribed a regimen which, in conjunction with the treatment, produced the best results. The more Napoleon got to know Corvisart, the more highly he esteemed him. And when he became emperor, he attached him to his person as his first and only medical advisor. Napoleon was at that time moderately stout. His stoutness was increased later on by the frequent use of baths, which he took to refresh himself after his fatigues. It may be mentioned that he had taken the habit of bathing himself every day at irregular hours, a practice which he considerably modified when it was pointed out by his doctor that the frequent use of hot baths and the time he spent in them were weakening and would predispose to obesity. Napoleon was of mediocre stature, about 5 feet 2 inches. I don't think that's accurate. And well built, though the bust was rather long. His head was big and the skull largely developed. His neck was short and his shoulders broad. The size of his chest bespoke a robust constitution, less robust, however, than his mind. His legs were well shaped. His foot was small and well formed. His hand, and he was rather proud of it, was delicate and plump with tapering fingers. His forehead was high and broad, his eyes gray, penetrating, and wonderfully mobile. His nose was straight and well-shaped. His teeth were fairly good, the mouth perfectly modeled, the upper lip slightly drawn down toward the corner of the mouth, and the chin slightly prominent. His skin was smooth and his complexion pale, but of a pallor which denoted a good circulation of the blood. His very fine chestnut hair, which until the time of the expedition to Egypt he had worn long, cut square and covering his ears, was clipped short. The hair was thin on the upper part of his head and left bare his forehead, the seat of such lofty thoughts. The shape of his face and the ensemble of his features were remarkably regular. In one word, his head and his bust were in no way inferior in nobility and dignity to the most beautiful bust which antiquity has bequeathed to us.